Welcome to Grappling with Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us better navigate the moral challenges of life and better see both sides of complex issues. I'm Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I'd like to welcome today's guests. With me, I have Laura Gray for the first time. She is a passionate people connector, columnist, author, and development director of the ALS Association Northern Ohio chapter. We have again Mark O'Brien, founder and principal of O'Brien Communications Group, helping companies manage their brands, solve their problems, and simplify the complex. And also back again is Peter Wittig, who is the founder and CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage and host of the Leveraging Thought Leadership podcast. Thank you all for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And here is today's ethics challenge. 15 years after retirement, a prominent metropolitan city police commissioner passes away. He was highly effective during his long term of service as both the face of the department to the public and as an advocate for the welfare of his officers. He was both admired and respected throughout the force and throughout much of the city. After his retirement, he recorded 60 hours a week as an administrator for a local charity. However, behind the scenes, he was guilty of misuse of power, misappropriation of funds, and other egregious instances of graft. Upon investigation, the current commissioner discovers that his involvement with the charity was nominal. He showed up infrequently, fulfilled few responsibilities, and used his office for extramarital activities. Traditionally, former commissioners have always received large-scale funerals, not merely to honor the individual, but to honor the office and the institution. The current commissioner finds himself caught between pressure from top brass to hold the traditional funeral ceremony with full regalia as a show of respect for the department, on the one side, and his own contempt for the man who abused the power of the office on the other. What are the current commissioner's options, and how should he decide what to do? And if this scenario sounds familiar, that means that you are a fan of Blue Bloods, because this was in last week's episode, but we are not going to use Frank Reagan's model to decide what we think ought to be done. So the floor is open.
I have to say that, first of all, I did see that episode. But prior to this moment, I never wondered about the purpose for the traditional ceremony and I guess I'll call it the pageantry. So I never even thought to wonder if there was as much public relations purpose in that as in honoring the deceased.
Well, if you think about recently, we saw what was done for the Queen of England.
Right.
And it wasn't just for Elizabeth, it was for the crown.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we can draw at least some sort of association there.
Yeah, and I'm going to build on what Mark said. Is as you were unpacking the scenario, Yonason, it was this. You said something about, is it really the individual or the office and the institution, right? And at some level, if it's the office and the institution, that's one set of standards that you'd look at it. But a funeral is about as an individual thing. You're not burying the office. So there is this built-in conflict here. And I think we're also living in an age now where, we're taking down statues and we're judging people by maybe different standards, right? Today's standards versus when they lived, which is a different version of this scenario. This is clearly, this guy did some funky stuff, some bad stuff, right? But I think an extension of that is, do you judge someone by the contemporary standards of the time or the current standards?
I mean, that's a really interesting point, Peter. I hadn't thought of that, there are a lot of types of behaviors that really have always been inappropriate, but were more common and were more accepted. And when you live in a society where something is accepted, I mean, my mother, maybe some of you are old enough to remember Jack Webb, a great producer. My mother was one of his secretaries, and she saw some of the stuff you hear about. in those, the young women who wanted acting interviews or acting jobs. I mean, really unsavory behaviors. We don't excuse it, God forbid. But at the same time, the standards then are not the standards now, and that does enter into at least the discussion. Laura, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I'm sitting here. My initial reaction was when you sent it, first of all, if I'm ever on a jury, you're guilty. So my impulse is like, well, absolutely not. We're not having this. No, he's guilty. So, and as the others have pointed out some interesting things, and, it's, you don't excuse it, but do you honor it? And is that a form of honor of the person? In a way, it still is, but even though the office. So I guess if I'm thinking about that, so for honoring the office or the position, and oh, by the way, honoring the person, because as Peter said, it is certainly personal and that person is part of it. But what does that do in a way of dilution, or whatever the appropriate word is, for those that have passed prior that had, maybe more integrity, and the other areas of the conversation of, well, this is how we do it now, but that's not how we did it then. And I'm kind of like, well, when did wrong not become just wrong? Why? And this is obviously grappling with the gray. So
Yeah, I would say two other things that popped into my mind as we're talking about this is the undoing of honoring someone. So I'm thinking of two instances in particular. So Bernie Kerik was the police commissioner for Giuliani a long time ago. And one way they honored him, he was a great commissioner, judged by crime went down, murder went down, all that stuff. I'm a New Yorker, so I very, very clearly remember it. And they named a prison after him downtown by Center Street. It was the Bernie Kerik Detention Center. Bernie spent several nights there when he was arrested for fraud. He went to jail for doing all sorts of wacky, fraudulent things. They changed the name of the building, right? Mike Milken donated, I don't know how many zillions of dollars to Wharton as an alum for the MBA program. He had his issues. Wharton took the name down. Similar thing, right? At the moment in time, the deeds that they did were great. And then, other things happened, or other things came out, and, probably not great to have a convicted felon have a prison named after him.
Well, think about Saint Christopher, who I believe is not a saint anymore, because they discovered some nefarious goings on with him.
Yeah. Well, did they desaint him? Is that a word?
That's what I heard. I
think it's desanitized.
Desanitized.
as opposed to Santa Claus.
Right. I shouldn't ask a rabbi about desainting. I just like,
Yes.
Yeah, that's not my specialty.
But I guess then I start to go, well, what's true? I mean, yeah, I can hear that this person committed fraud, but said who? And I don't know. I think I'm just in a phase of my life where I'm questioning and I'm looking to all resources. Now, if in this particular scenario where the actual commissioner did the investigating, it sounds like himself, and uncovered some things, then yeah, in this case, it sounds like, okay, this is not a good guy. How do we honor him or his life? Wow, that's tough.
Another thing about this scenario is that the nefarious activity was mostly unknown.
Right.
So it's not as if we're honoring somebody whom the public recognizes as being of questionable character. Perception does seem to conflate with reality.
But didn't the tree still fall in the woods?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm basically with you. I mean, it would rub me. There's a story I heard a number of years ago. I read it actually from a very respected rabbi. So when he was young and knew the rabbinate, he was officiating over a funeral of a man who was absolutely reprehensible. I mean, he mistreated his family, he mistreated his colleagues. The person was just reprehensible. And this very elderly lady comes up to him before the funeral and says, "Listen, sonny," said to the rabbi, "tell everybody that he loved his children and he was a good man." And he said to her, but you know he wasn't. Of course I know he wasn't. But so what? What difference does it make now?
Mhm.
Now, I appreciated an element of wisdom there, but that has never sat well with me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's, anyway, Mark, what's on your mind?
Well, I'm having a little bit of trouble separating the chicken and the egg here. Because I think there are a couple of other things going on that actually have been suggested here already. First of all, there's, I guess I would call it the evolution of consciousness. So it's not just norms and mores that continue to change, but we change. And I'll just cite one example from literature. When Sherwood Anderson wrote Winesburg, Ohio, in I think 1920, there was not wide acknowledgement of mental illness, but he suggested it in one of the sections of Winesburg, Ohio, called Paper Pills. And it was about this guy in town who carried these little pieces of crumpled up paper in his pocket. And he would just, do this with them. And now, I mean, notions of or awareness of mental health are everywhere. And you can talk about it. And I also, the other part of this thing I can't put together in any necessary order is the ubiquity of electronic media. And it's virtually impossible to hide anything from anyone. And one of the things I always think about is there's a book called Havana Nocturne about the rise of the American mob in Cuba before the Castro Revolution. And there was a guy named Trafficante who was in charge of the Tampa mob. And he said one of his enormous regrets was that he hadn't put movie cameras in the Havana hotel room in which he set up a young Jack Kennedy with 5 prostitutes. I mean, try to get away with that one today. So it's just, we have this sort of hyper awareness of everything that obviously enough we didn't have before. Of course, we're going to think differently because we can know so much more, or at least think we do, to Laura's point.
Yeah.
And the truth that it baffles me. I mean, it absolutely baffles me. And we keep hearing about the same kinds of scandals from people who can't possibly imagine that they won't be seen or won't be recorded. It's really quite, it really does boggle the mind. But at the same time, that should, emphasis on should, make us more conscious of our public behavior, which one would hope would spill over into our private behavior, and it doesn't seem to be happening.
There was a young man who worked for me for about 13 years or so, and he used to get so mad at the proliferation of video surveillance. And I would say to him, well, then don't do anything wrong. and that would anger him all the more. Well, it's not anybody else's business. Really? In an orderly society, it's nobody's business if you want to break the law? I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's another, or there is another thought here that I have, which is this about honoring that person's service and their life and looking the other way and say, well, he served as a commissioner, blah, blah, blah. I'm thinking the other way, sort of the legacy of the institution that I'm sure has a mission, vision, value statement, honor, integrity, blah, blah, blah. When you take an oath to be an officer, you're promising these certain things. And if they know that what that person did, assuming it's not gray, he actually did it, it's not just an accusation, it's in absolute violation of what they stand for, how could they do that, right? Because that's done, and people look back at that, would go back at that. What about a young recruit thinking of a career in the police force going, ooh, their values are out of line. They say, yeah, that's the stuff that's, etched in stone on the wall, but this is what they really did.
Well,
Yeah.
then the question there is, who knew?
Yeah. Well, I think then to me, like, I kind of want to segue off of that a little too, the expression integrity is doing the right thing when no one's looking, whether you're on camera or not, you're doing the right thing. And I think, the other thing, when you talk about the institution, Peter, especially right now, I'm all about transparency. If you turn it around and say, you know what, this is what we usually do, but this is what we've discovered. And I think I would be like, whoa, man, I have complete respect that you guys just did that. I'm just tired of brooms and dustpans and secrecy, and because it feeds into society and it just creates this dark energy.
You know, that's so interesting. There was a guy who came here yesterday. We're having a sunroom built in the back, and a young guy, he's 42. This young guy came to deliver flooring. And there was a piece I could see underneath the box of his truck. There was a piece that was broken. I said, do you know about this? And he said, yeah. And he told me that whenever he takes one of the trucks, if it gets dinged or something while he's using it, he'll take a photograph of it. And when he gets back to wherever he has to go with the truck, he'll report it. So he said, nobody's going to accuse me of doing that because they know that I would report anything, and I even record it. So to your point, Laura, about transparency, I mean, that just struck me as brilliant when he shared that with me yesterday.
Yeah, if you conduct it, and I should put it on myself, right? If I conduct myself in a way that demonstrates consistent, unbroken integrity, then when I need to draw on that, when there is some suspicion, I have a lot of capital.
Yes.
That speaks for me.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll as you're talking, there's the social media piece, this always on piece, this everybody watching piece. I think something that literally just happened this week is, Kanye or Ye or whatever his thing is, said what he said, and everybody was like, oh my God, it's anti-Semitic, it's horrible, it's horrible. And then they put the pressure on Adidas. Adidas finally did the right thing. But I look at that and say, sorry, Adidas, a day late and a dollar short. I'm done with Adidas, right? That's my personal decision. Yes. Could you say they finally did the right thing? Yeah, after they had a PR firm engage public opinion and watch social media and and did the math, like that should have been a no-brainer decision.
And after they did one more thing, which is to release his shoe. They put the shoe in the market.
Right.
So now
Which
think
they'll
about
make
that.
more off of it now. They'll make more off of it now. So
Yes, they
what
will.
is real? What's contrived? I'm just kind of over the whole circus that's been going on.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting you bring that up, Peter, because I saw a post, I think it's today or yesterday, but I think it's today, about a Jewish person praising Adidas, saying he's going out to buy 3 pairs of Adidas and he thinks everybody should do the same, and to thank them for doing the right thing.
But I think, part of this is, Jonathan, is if it takes you 2 weeks to figure out what the right thing is, I don't trust what went into that decision. We know certain things are right and wrong. Yes, this is about the gray. I get it. But like if we have to have a task force or research this or do the economic analysis.
Well, and it's especially hinky because, they decided after the fact, for whatever reason, whoa, we better virtue signal here. I mean, where do they think that's going to get them? Except for the fact, as Laura pointed out, those shoes are going to be worth a ton of money to whoever might have bought them.
That's right. And a year ago, what? So he goes into rehab and he comes back bigger than ever. Mea culpa, life goes on. So anyways.
This is only tangentially related to the topic, but the whole subject of Ye and whatever he's been doing came up this morning. And I wonder if the only way for a person in his position to get any meaningful comeuppance is financially. Because I think there's a point at which if you have enough money, you're just kind of insulated. I mean, if I got enough money, what's anybody going to do to me? But if suddenly everything that's constituted my market is just being taken away from me, I don't know. I'm either going to live in misery or I'm going to figure something out, it seems to me.
So I mean, a lot of this comes down to, and then trying to get back a little bit to our original question, a lot of it comes back to compartmentalization, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That, And again, to the shades of gray, I mean, I'm going to go on record with a confession that there were times in my almost 35 years of marriage that I raised my voice to my wife. I know, looks of shock.
I
But
mean, you're human.
well, yeah, on a good day. You know, and you know, certainly in Jewish tradition, that's a really serious transgression. It's not something that we take lightly. And yet we are human beings. We do make mistakes. Sometimes it takes us a while to respond the way we should. And is it better to get there eventually, even if we don't get there as quickly? In the case of the police commissioner, in terms of the job, he fulfilled his duties in many ways admirably. At the same time, he abused his position. So, you know, at what point, you know, if he raised his voice to his wife, would that be reason to question giving him a funeral? You know, there is no clear line, which is why there's no app for ethics. But you know, we struggle because we don't want to honor a person who is lacking in integrity, but we do want to honor the performance of a position when it's been done well. And when those two clash, we're really stuck. How do we decide which one takes priority?
Well, you know, it's also interesting, briefly. So we're talking about a police commissioner, not a patrolman. And years ago, I was employed somewhere. And when we started, we signed what was considered a letter of integrity. I will never cross these lines, etc.
Yep.
And I was in a role that I became privy to certain people that were higher up on the food chain who were crossing the lines. And I kind of spoke up and they were like, well, but he's this. And I'm like, I'm done. I'm done. Here's my line and I'm crossing it and I'm leaving because I didn't want to. I mean, again, here's me. If I'm on a jury, you're guilty, case dismissed or whatever. And I know. So, and I felt just so to sign something like that. So you're a police commissioner and you have all these things that, you know, to uphold, etc. You know, would have been different if he was a patrolman. Then I mean, so at what part does level or rank come into play of the gray?
I mean, there's the more authority, the more responsibility to uphold those standards.
I would think.
Well, yeah, it makes sense.
But also the more latitude to abuse them.
Yes, and to get away with it.
Say that it's also the consistent application of the standards, that it shouldn't be different for in your case, Laura, a frontline or a junior employee. And then, you know, the big shots are doing things, but, you know, nobody knows and we don't want to lose them or they bring in the bucks or whatever the case.
Right.
I feel like I'm in something of a weird position because my dad was a Marine, and actually I think he might be the only person I can imagine who actually enjoyed boot camp. But he was, you know, he was a guy, just tell me the rules, I'm good, I'm going to do whatever the rules say I should do. And so I firmly believe that. And then on the other hand, Grandpa O'Brien used to grin and say, it's the exception that proves the rule. So I have to find some balance in there somewhere.
So how about if I put each of you on the spot? You are the advisor to the commissioner. He has to decide what he's going to do about this funeral. What will you tell him?
I'll go for it.
No, please go right ahead.
My advice would be to, I would advise to take a stand and not do the funeral, or in addition to that, be really public about the why. And get out in front of it. So we're not going to do this funeral, which we normally do for people in service, but we believe that role holds people to a higher standard, and whatever it is, it's a lack of alignment to our values. But I would not just make the decision, but, you know, like when kids do the math today, show the work. how did we come to that decision and why?
And what I was going to say, Peter, and as you were talking, I found myself rethinking it, which is, I think, why we're here. I was just going to say, well, yeah, I agree with Laura. I mean, the guy didn't, the deceased commissioner didn't uphold the rules and whatever, so I'm not going. However, if I'm the commissioner and I have to make that decision, I have a responsibility to the rest of the department, obviously enough to be there. I guess I don't necessarily need to praise the gentleman who passed away, but just, you know, show up for the troops and like that. And that's obviously, it's tough. That's why we're here. But I think that would be my inclination. I couldn't allow myself to say anything positive about the gentleman. But for the sake of the 35,000 or whatever troops on the department, I'd want to be there.
So I think in my case, so 35,000 whispers, rumors travel fast. I think they would know, and I think that would be a disappointment and a little gut punch for the younger people. So I would, it would be, hey, not an easy choice or decision, but I would vote for complete transparency. Not on my watch. This is what I uncovered. And oh, by the way, we usually spend $100,000 on this funeral. We are now going to put that into the city schools. We are going to donate that to the Police Athletic League. We are going to ensure that every child in this city has a bike helmet. I mean, you flip that messaging, and that to me would go a long way.
Wow. That's pretty compelling.
Yeah, I like that. That's really, really creative. And you sort of may have pushed me back to indecisiveness. You know, when I first was presented with this scenario, I felt almost exactly the way you articulated yourself, Peter. It's a no-brainer, but I ended up more where you ended up, Mark, that this is less about the man and more about the institution, and that there may be subtle ways of communicating that things are not completely on the up and up. One of my rabbis, who is a rabbi in you know, substantial Jewish community, Orthodox community for many years, and people would come and vacation there, including other rabbinic figures, some of whom he respected and some of whom he didn't. And because of their position, he was sometimes obligated to invite them to speak to his congregation, which put him in a very uncomfortable position because he didn't want to endorse their message, and yet he was the one inviting them to speak. So in Hebrew, the pronunciation of rabbi is Rav. And so what he started doing is, if it was a figure that he respected, he would introduce them as Rav so-and-so. And if it was someone he didn't respect, he would introduce them as Rabbi so-and-so. And eventually his congregation caught on that he would make this distinction. Now, there's nothing intrinsically disrespectful about calling somebody rabbi, although sometimes the way people use it to mean. But you know, there are nuances that we can employ to indicate that we're doing something that we might have to be holding our nose a little bit, or there may be a side to it. But you know, that creative approach, I think, is very consistent with what you're suggesting, Laura. Is if you take the other stance and don't have the funeral, do it in a way that makes clear that we are trying to honor integrity and we're trying to protect the department and protect the institution from corruption. And it's still our form of honoring it.
And I was actually thinking more about what Laura suggested as well. Maybe it's possible that you just do a much smaller ceremony. So the money that would otherwise have been spent, as Laura suggested, could be put to better community use. And what occurred to me was that there's another benefit in that. Well, first of all, I want to comment on the brilliant transparency of that, Laura. but it's also an intrinsic reinforcement of the standards. These are the standards that we expect you to uphold as a member of this department. That guy didn't do it.
Mhm.
We need to acknowledge that and recognize that we all need to have that higher standard of conduct.
Well, I think it's also an opportunity to say lots of things in life are negotiable as an institution. These are our non-negotiables, period. Full stop.
Yeah.
And I think lots of organizations look the other way. I mean, your example of Rev versus Rab, you know, there's subtleties and nuance, but then there's black and white too. Like,
You know, the only thing that really bums me out about this conversation is that I wanted to write for Blue Bloods, but Laura, now I think you should. I hate it when that happens.
You know, I had a Frank Reagan for president meme written up, but that didn't seem to gain any traction. But when, you know, the point that inevitably we come back to, and which is so much a premise of these discussions, is that we lock ourselves into binary thinking. Either you have the funeral or you don't have the funeral, and that's it.
Mm.
And that's a recipe for gridlock and you know, for indecision. Looking for creative ways to navigate these types of dilemmas is the answer, and I think we've seen quite a bit of that here. So I thank you all, Laura Gray, Mark
Thank
O'Brien,
you.
Peter Winnick. It's been a
Thank you.
very stimulating discussion, and I certainly hope you will join me again. If you in the audience would like to suggest a dilemma, a real dilemma, a movie, a TV show, or something you've thought of, please go to jonasongoldson.com, use the contact information there. And if it's something that's compelling, we will certainly take it up on a future program. If you would like to become a Grappling with the Gray member, please go to gwtg.live, gwtg.live. You can sign up for a free 30-day trial and enjoy member benefits. And if you'd like to raise your ethical awareness, you can also go to jonasongoldson.com/freebie, FREEBIE, where you can request a free ebook, infographic, or white paper. Please join us again next week for another ethical discussion as our panel grapples with the gray.